Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse, and we're heading into the home stretch of our series on Flavius Josephus, Against Apion, where we're dismantling the canonical interpretation of Josephus. We are arguing that the 22 books that he singles out, he does so not because they alone are inspired or they alone are authoritative, but because they alone represent superior historiography and they record the history prior to Artaxerxes, which is the time in which the Greek opponents argue that the Jewish race didn't exist and that his work on the antiquities of the Jews is false. So, in the last episode, we took a look at, I think, a very insightful theory proposed by Joseph Blenkinsop about the Levites eventually becoming scribes and having a prophetic charism about it. So eventually, the prophets weren't the only ones that were able to pen inspired scripture. There was also scribes, and that explains some very important things that otherwise I think in Josephus it's very difficult to explain. For example, how he could say that only prophets could write history, and yet there are individuals within the 22 book period, so this would be the proto-canonical books, that are identified as being something other than prophets, such as Ezra. And we already went through that theory. I'm not going to rehash it here, but I think there's great explanatory power in his theory. It certainly helps us understand Josephus. It also helps us understand the limitations of just looking at how Josephus uses the word prophet and all its different cognates, and showing that there is just a lot of data that isn't captured by that process. And also opens the door, by the way, for other prophets that we normally wouldn't consider prophets, such as Sirach, who Blenkinsop sees as kind of the quintessential scribe, and also Maccabees, right? Because the Maccabees also are historians, but the author wouldn't fit into an oracular prophet, but it would fit the scribal clerical type prophet. So we're going to do our last area, and I think this is the strongest argument for the canonical interpretation, and that is the idea that Josephus singles out the 22 books as being unalterable text, and that fact alone shows that he believed that these books were divinely inspired and authoritative, since no one could change them. We're going to take a closer look, so fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. Way back at the very beginning of this series, we talked about how Eusebius adds a few words to Josephus, and these are uniquely his. And one of those words is that he says that the 22 books are justly believed to be divine. The word divine is not there. So just a little reminder, because I want to quote Boole, Franz Boole, who I think explains the next layer of argument. And like I said in the preview, I think this is probably the strongest of the arguments for the canonical interpretation. So let's find out what Boole says. He says, quote, even if the phrase divine writings be not genuine, he yet says that only those books can lay claim to our confidence, and that no one has been so bold as to either to add anything to them or take anything away from these books transmitted from olden times. And thus, at the end of the first century after Christ, we have undoubted evidence of a clear and conscious conviction of the canonical collection of writings and unanimity with regards to this canon as it is now known among ourselves, unquote. Boole's point, therefore, is that, yeah, even if the interpolation is a interpolation, which, like I said, all modern critical editions of Against Apion show, you still have the problem of that he says these books are unalterable. You can't add or subtract from them. These are kind of frozen in time. And therefore, he equates, and this line of argument equates the stability of the text with the canonicity of the text. Now, there's lots of problems with that in and of itself, but let's examine this claim on its own. First, let's go to Against Apion. This is sections 42 and 43. And let's hear what Josephus says. And then we're going to outline the positive cases or points that can be made in favor of canonical interpretation. And then we will look more critically at it, whether or not it actually says what Boole and others say it says. Okay, so here's Against Apion 142-43. Quote, "It is clear in practice how we approach our own writings. Although such a long time has now passed, no one has dared to add, to take away, or to alter anything. And it is innate in every Judean, right from birth, to regard them as decrees of God, to remain faithful to them, and, if necessary, gladly to die on their behalf. Thus, to date, many have been seen on many occasions as prisoners of war, suffering torture and all kinds of deaths in the theaters for not letting slip a single word in contravention of the laws and the records associated with them." So there are several lines, the argument that could be drawn from this in favor of the canonical interpretation. First is the claim that the 22 books were held sacrosanct since, quote, "a long time has now passed. No one has dared to add, to take away, or to alter anything. Their sacredness points to inspiration and canonicity." The second point that's made from this paragraph is that they are said to contain, quote, "the decrees of God," Theou dogmata, which is a clear and unmistakable reference to divine content. So if these have a clear and unmistakable claim to divine content, then that distinguishes it from the latter histories. The third claim, Josephus expects his opponents could verify his claim with his countrymen, thus making him, as Ryle puts it, quote, "a spokesman for his people," unquote. So many people point to this paragraph and say, Josephus is not making something new. This is not something eccentric to himself. He's saying these things, and this would be very easy to verify in the first century if his opponents had chose to do so. So therefore, this is a universal claim that no Jew could deny. So those are very strong lines of arguments from this text. But let's take a critical look at it and see whether each of these lines of argument actually hold true. We should first note that Josephus is using exaggeration for rhetorical effect in this passage. So unless one believes that Jewish infants are genetically predisposed to recognize the decrees of God in particular writings, this point really is inescapable. In other words, it's clear there are elements of exaggeration here. So I think that loosens up the case a little bit. But I don't want to put too much weight on this. I think it's there. And I think it gives us some wiggle room that perhaps he might be overstating things a little bit in order to make a point. But that's not quite saying he's lying. But on the other hand, if Josephus is referring to an unalterable fixed text of 22 books, as Boole does, one might be tempted actually to accuse Josephus not of mere exaggeration, but of an outright lie or fabrication, since the task of stabilizing a single Hebrew text tradition was only beginning at the time when Josephus penned Against Apion, roughly around 100 AD. And this is the consensus of scholars on this point, that roughly around the turn of the first century, that's when a stabilization occurred with the MT, which eventually becomes the rabbinic text. So a single universally recognized fixed text at this point in time actually runs counter to all the available evidence. There's a chronological problem. So for Josephus, if he's actually claiming that there is a fixed text that's stabilized and universally recognized by all Jews at 100 AD, he's either lying or he is fabricating. It's certainly something that's beyond a mere exaggeration. But we don't have to go down that road because there are other ways to understand Josephus where you don't really have that very big tension. So let's look at that other understanding. Now, the text under consideration represents a transition in Josephus at this point in Against Apion. For he was moving from comparing the best practices of historiography in regards to the 22 books. Now he's transitioned to the care shown by the people in regards to our books, quote unquote. Okay. So this marks a transition in his argumentation. So it seems like he's starting to argue something on different grounds. Okay. Josephus's attention seems to be specifically focused in this paragraph, not on the 22 books, the whole or nearly the whole of the proto-canonical books in the Old Testament, but specifically the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. And there are several pointers that this is specifically what he's referring to in this paragraph. For example, he references to, quote, such a long time has passed, unquote. And of course, this is especially true for the books of Moses, since they're the most ancient of the Jewish writings. In fact, he makes note of the fact that they are the most ancient in Book 2 of Against Apion, section 154. Likewise, Josephus's words about not adding or taking away anything strongly echoes the injunction given in Deuteronomy 4:2 and 13:1. So this, of course, is a Deuteronomic prescription not to alter the Torah. Okay. We could add on top of that another interesting similarity that the similar language is also used in regards to the translation of the Torah into Greek. In other words, this idea of not adding or subtracting was used for the Jewish interpreters or translators of the Septuagint in regards to reproducing the Torah, which becomes later on the Septuagint. And as you know, with the development of the Septuagint, it originally begins with the Torah, and then it's expanded to include the rest of the Old Testament. So this particular phrase was given during that area of development when the Septuagint was first being translated. So it's speaking specifically about Torah, not talking about the prophets and the writings. Josephus's reference to the decrees of God, which I think is probably the strongest point, this theou dogmata, okay? It's used only here in Josephus, and it seems to refer something closer to legislation rather than history, right? The dogmata fits more of a law rather than history, right? We don't speak of history as dogmata, okay? Indeed, Josephus uses a similar statement elsewhere in Against Apion. I think this is probably a very important key that, yes, he's focusing on the Torah. In Against Apion, Book 2, section 153, he says, quote, such being the case, it is the virtue of the legislator to recognize what is best and to win consent to the laws he lays down from those who will make use of them. And it is the virtue of the people to remain faithful to all that has been approved. Now, notice this, and to make no alterations, either in favorable or in adverse circumstances. So here he's talking about the legislator, Moses, and the books of Moses, right? And that these laws have been laid down, and it's the virtue of the people to remain faithful to all that's been approved and make no alterations, like we just saw, and either favorable or in adverse circumstances. And that speaks to him talking about the Jews being willing to be tortured and even put to death without contravening the law. And I think Barclay, therefore, is correct when he says The word dogmatis suggests a ruling or ordinance, and thus fits the laws in the Pentateuch more obviously than any other genre. Indeed, the laws are the real topic of the rest of the section, and the next, with the quote unquote records tacked on rather loosely at the end of 144 unquote. So I think that really hits the nail on the head, that this dogma of God, or the laws of God, that's really speaking to legislation, namely the Pentateuch and the laws in the Pentateuch specifically. And that's the real topic of this section. In Against Apion 143, Josephus speaks of the Jews being tortured and martyred rather than, quote, letting slip a single word in contravention of the laws and the records associated with them. So what do I make about that? That seems to say that they did not allow even a single letter or a single word be altered. Doesn't that speak to a fixed, stabilized canonical text? Well, I believe the qualification in contravention of the laws is really key. Josephus is not saying that the Jews would be willing to die rather than to change a word of the fixed, stabilized, standardized text. I don't think that's what he's saying, but that the text could not be altered so as to contravene the law, which is something very different, right? We're not talking about altering the text or changing a word in the text if that word really doesn't contravene what the law actually says. So this interpretation has a lot of benefits. For example, it has the benefit of rescuing Josephus from the charge of gross exaggeration, if not fabrication or just plain out lying. It coheres very well with what we know about the stabilization of the Hebrew text. And it also fits very well with Josephus's own reworking of scripture text and antiquities. And this is an important point. If Josephus is saying that you're not allowed to alter even one word in the whole of scripture, then how do you explain antiquities of the Jews? Because here, most of it is recounting what he has in his sacred books, and he clearly reworks the text. He changes things in the text. So if it's an unalterable fixed text that he's talking about, he himself doesn't even follow that. But if he says that you could not alter the text so as to contravene part of the law of Moses, then at least there's wiggle room there that, yeah, he might be faithful in that regard. But he's definitely not talking about a fixed, stabilized text that's unalterable and canonical. Going back to Barclay, he says, quote, death for the laws as textual phenomena only inasmuch as they contain the rules and customs obeyed by the Judeans, not as a written historical records in themselves. So he's not talking about altering the text, like a single word of the text, but he's talking about altering the words so as to contravene the rules and the customs obeyed by the Judeans. Those are two very big things. He's not talking about a textual phenomenon. Rather, he's talking about obedience to the law. And that fits in very well with everything we know. In fact, he's making a reference here to probably the Maccabean martyrs. That seems to be the primary example that he could give of Jews that were willing to die and be tortured. But notice they were willing to die and be tortured, not because they refused to alter a word in Esther. Maccabean martyrs were tortured and killed because they refused to disobey the law, right? They would not break the law. Two very different things. Finally, we should also note that even if one concedes the fixed text interpretation, it still doesn't justify the claim that Josephus was positing a closed 22-book canon. If Josephus's chief concern is to establish that the history contained in the 22 books accord with the most trusted historiography, then Against Apion 142 and 43 would only underscore his point. it says nothing about the status of the later histories unless Josephus also included them along with our own writings, quote unquote, that is, the records associated with the law. So, in summary, there's two different ways you can interpret this paragraph: either a fixed text where a single word could not be altered. That is what's used to try to bolster the canonical interpretation. Or you can see it as him speaking specifically about the Torah as legislation, and that the Jews would not allow the text to be altered in such a way as to contravene the laws of Moses, which does allow for some fluidity in the text, and it also coheres well with how Josephus uses the things. And so I think of the two, I think the latter has many more benefits and greater explanatory power than the former. However, even if you don't accept the latter interpretation and you believe he really is talking about single, stabilized text that cannot be altered, something like what's often claimed for the Quran, even if you go that far, folks, it still doesn't give you the canonical interpretation. All it does is shows that he's just adding on more information about the 22 books, but it doesn't really say anything about the books written afterwards. In fact, the books written afterwards could very well be included in that. Although I think that has problems in itself because, like I said, there's pointers in the text. They seem to be speaking specifically about the Torah or the Pentateuch or the 5 books of Moses. That's really his focus. All right, so we'll park it right there. And we're going to do one last video on the series. I know many of you are probably going to rejoice that this is the end of the series. But I'm going to try to summarize all of the arguments up so far, and we'll conclude the series next week. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe, like, hit the bell, leave some comments, tell your friends about the channel. Also, as I say every episode, William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. We really, really appreciate your support because it helps defray costs in getting some very expensive books. In fact, several were very expensive for me to run down all the different critical editions of Josephus and so on. And it's through your generosity that it didn't really affect my family's budget. So that's truly appreciated. If you can, support us. Until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.